It was supposed to be impossible. A tiny, open-top Jeep meant to carry radios, coffee, and messages against a German tank weighing 20, 30 times more. Soldiers laughed when the idea was first thrown out. They called it a joke. They called it reckless. And then, in the dust and heat outside Kazan, and later in the hedgerows of Normandy, those little machines rolled out under the roar of engines and fired once. The world learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the thing meant to carry mail becomes the thing that saves lives. This is the story of the man who saw a Jeep as more than a vehicle, and the idea that changed how small fights were won. By 1943, Allied forces were learning a brutal lesson. German armor, Panzer IV's first, then heavier Panthers and Tigers, could punch through infantry lines, crush positions, and outrun the slow-moving response teams. The U.S. had heavy tank destroyers on paper, the M10, the M18, but those vehicles were costly, needed maintenance, and could not always get into the rough, broken ground, where ambushes and raids were happening. Frontline units, scouts, supply convoys, and raiding parties were often exposed to armored threats they could not stop. What the front needed was speed, not size, mobility, not weight, something small that could move fast across terrain. The big tanks couldn't strike and vanish. Engineers on the ground heard the complaints from commanders and the pleas from soldiers. They had to improvise. In workshops and behind supply dumps, men began thinking differently about the Jeep, the Willys, the Ford, tiny four-wheeled machines born to run errands and carry small loads. To a lot of officers, the Jeep was just a vehicle. To the men who used them every day, it was an opportunity. He was not a headline. He would never be in a paper for daring deeds. He was a mechanic by trade, a tinkerer who had worked in small factories and repair shops before Uncle Sam drafted him. Call him Harold Willis, call him the engineer, call him whichever name works in your script. What mattered was that he knew how things fit and how forces worked. He'd seen a field full of wrecked Jeeps and thought less about what was broken and more about what could be built. Willis had an advantage. He understood the Jeep from the bolt up. He knew suspensions, spring rates, balance points. He could look at a small car and calculate where weight could go, where stress would concentrate, and how much reinforcement the chassis could take before it snapped. That knowledge became the starting point for an idea people at command desks scoffed at. Mount a gun on a Jeep and use speed and surprise to level the playing field. Imagine making a shopping cart out of a lawnmower and telling someone it can stop a locomotive. That's how many officers reacted when the enlisted men proposed mounting anti-tank weapons on a Jeep. A tank's gun had recoil. Armored crews relied on heavy, stable platforms to fire and absorb force. A Jeep was light. It would kick. It might flip. It offered no protection for its crew. It seemed suicidal. And yet the battlefield often forced choices between the impractical and the impossible. The math on paper made the cynics right. Mounting a 37mm or a recoilless rifle risked tearing the vehicle apart. The first rough mounts did. The first test firings nearly flipped the prototypes. Tires shredded, frames cracked, and the early vehicles were loud failures. But there was something else on the battlefield. Necessity. Units with no heavy weaponry had to do something or be overrun. Innovation often looks stupid until it works, and that was the difference between scribbling new plans on a map and heading out to the front with bolts and a torch. They started small. Remove the rear seats, weld a steel plate to the frame, reinforce the spring mounts, add sandbags where needed to keep weight centered, fasten a 37mm M3 gun or a captured anti-tank piece to a turntable platform in the back. Put 2 men in the Jeep, driver and gunner, and hope the engine and springs could take the punishment. For protection, they improvised low plates and slat shields to keep debris from spraying into the crew. The first prototype looked ridiculous. A bare, skeletal Jeep with a gun that dwarfed its chassis. It was noisy, crude, and terrifying to ride in. But on a test range, it could get into position, fire, and limp away. That, more than anything else, changed the thinking of the men who had to fight in the field. A weapon that could be brought into places tanks couldn't go could act as a force multiplier if crews used speed and cover to their advantage. Trial and error became the rule. The men learned the importance of balance, where to add weight, where to cut, how to brace the chassis. They learned how to mount the gun so the muzzle blast would not destabilize the vehicle, and how to angle the platform to reduce recoil forces. Suspension had to be beefed up, tires swapped for stronger casings, steering packed with grease so it didn't lock on rough terrain. Most important, the crews learned tactics. The Jeep could not slug it out at close range with a tank. It had to use terrain, concealment, and timing. Striking at the flanks, firing for disabled tracks or optics, hitting supply trucks, or taking out exposed engine decks. These were practical targets for small guns. The Jeep's survival depended on mobility and the ability to disappear into terrain faster than an armored vehicle could reorient. Tactically, it became a guerrilla's tool in a larger conventional fight. The day the first modified Jeep saw combat, men at command still doubted. Orders were cautious. Use them where risk was acceptable and where heavy support could not reach quickly. The convoy was small. 5 reinforced Jeeps, with crews who knew the idea was half mad and half brilliant. At dawn, a German column rolled toward a supply route. Infantry were pinned near a ridge, unable to move. The modified Jeeps took position out of sight, behind low dunes and a scattering of scrub. When the column moved into the kill zone, the Jeeps darted out like hornets. They strafed along the flanks, firing 1 or 2 rounds at a time, and then swinging away before the tanks could bring their main guns to bear. The effect was not a theater-changing barrage. It was practical, precise damage. Engines were disabled, tracks shredded, vision slits smashed. German crews scrambled to respond to vehicles they had not expected to see. The firefight lasted minutes, but it was enough. The infantry withdrew, resupplied, and a route that would have been lost stayed open. Command took notice. The suicide wagons became a tool in the book of tactical improvisation. From that moment, the tactics honed in the field became repeatable. Crews adopted hit-and-run maneuvers, approach at dawn or dusk, use low sun as cover, fire a single precise shot at an exposed component, and retreat. Sometimes the target was a fuel truck, sometimes the turret ring, sometimes the optics that allowed a tank to see. The Jeep's goal was rarely to go toe-to-toe. Its goal was to take the edge off, to turn a rolling mass into an infantry problem. Integration with infantry and artillery improved outcomes. Jeeps would identify targets, mark positions, or coax tanks into terrain where heavies could get a better angle. In some cases, multiple Jeeps coordinated to create crossfire. Speed and surprise were the defensive elements that substituted for armor. As word spread, more units began to adopt their own versions. British Special Forces and some U.S. Ranger detachments experimented with different mounts. 37mm, 57mm, even Valentine, and captured German weapons. Recoilless rifles, a relatively new technology, found particular favor because they reduced the recoil that broke early prototypes. The recoilless principle dumped propellant gas backward to counter the forward force of the shell, allowing light vehicles to fire larger rounds without catastrophic structural damage. Field workshops standardized some mounts. Mechanics learned to place the gun on a reinforced subframe, with pivot points tied to the Jeep's center of gravity. Sandbags, extra fuel tanks, and armored plates were added selectively. Crews learned that survivability was not just armor, It was how quickly and silently you could get out of danger. Drivers became artists at finding broken ground that would conceal a chase, while gunners learned to shoot and then reseat the gun in seconds. One engagement became widely retold among veterans as the first proof the idea wasn't a gimmick. A recon column moving toward a forward supply dump encountered a mixed formation of enemy vehicles. The jeeps were sent ahead as scouts and, when contact was made, turned to ambush. Using a combination of flanking movement and careful timing, the small force disabled several armored cars and a medium tank's tracks, long enough for the main column to pass and for artillery to be called in. The casualties on both sides were limited compared to a full tank engagement, but the strategic outcome was clear. Speed and tactical disruption multiplied the effect of limited firepower. After that, commanders were less skeptical. The policy moved from ragtag improvisation towards sanctioned experimentation. Official manuals didn't endorse "mount your gun on the Jeep" as doctrine, but they stopped punishing crews who did. The Army didn't commission a whole fleet of gun jeeps overnight. It did, however, allow and encourage creative field modification under controlled circumstances, which meant more units experimented and more useful designs circulated across formations. It was not all success. A lightweight vehicle remained a target. When a gun failed or a driver misjudged the angle, the result could be fatal. Jeeps were exposed and vulnerable to artillery and air attack. There were losses. The men who drove them accepted risk. Some called it bravery, others called it desperate improvisation. The human cost tempered the glow of innovation. Skilled mechanics and crews were the difference between a vehicle that survived and one that was never seen again. For every successful ambush, there were stories of jeeps that did not outrun fate. The crews were often young, sometimes volunteers, sometimes assigned by necessity. Drivers had to be fearless or stupid. Gunners had to be precise and fast. Mechanics attached to those units became more than technicians. They were war innovators who welded, cut, and rebalanced machines at night, always with a wary eye out for the next patrol. Discipline mattered. A coordinated team could sting like a hornet. A careless one would be torn apart by return fire. The camaraderie among those teams built a culture of improvisation and trust that made the vehicles effective. Stories travel in wartime. A good idea seen at one front tended to appear at another in weeks. The British SAS, with long experience in deserts and raids, had their own approaches to mounting weapons on light vehicles. The Americans learned, adapted, and sometimes improved. After North Africa, the techniques and the mounting solutions were refined in Sicily, Italy, and eventually in northwestern Europe. Each theater added knowledge, the kinds of terrain that favored covert movement, the best armaments to use, and the integration of air and artillery support to make hit-and-run tactics sustainable. Choice of weapon was pragmatic. The 37mm was common and light. The 57mm had better punch. Recoilless rifles allowed larger rounds without massive recoil and became a clear win on light vehicles. Bazooka racks were also used for certain ambush styles. The decision depended on supply, mission, and the expected target. Each weapon demanded different crew drills and different movement profiles. The key remained the same. Fire one shot accurately, then move. A distracted crew, slow reload, or bad positioning turned a strength into a vulnerability. The gun jeep concept did not replace tanks. Instead, it seeded a doctrine of light, mobile strike vehicles, ideas that grew into post-war concepts for airborne, airmobile, and special operations forces. The same mentality, favoring speed, stealth, and tactical surprise over brute force, would show up in Korea and Vietnam. Light armored cars, gun trucks, and later purpose-built light attack vehicles owe something to these improvised beginnings. Military thinkers studied the experience and realized that small units with the right tool in the right place could have outsized effects on the battlefield. After the war, the engineer returned to a quieter life. He didn't seek medals, he didn't publish blueprints. He went back to a job wrenching engines in a small shop and telling young mechanics the lessons he had learned in the dust about balance, careful planning, and the value of doing the hard, invisible work right. When he spoke to old comrades, he emphasized the same thing: preparedness, innovation, and the responsibility to protect those who follow. For veterans who rode in those jeeps or fought beside them, the vehicles were symbols of ingenuity and brotherhood. Reunion halls echoed with stories of late nights in workshops, the smell of burning flux, and the sight of a jeep's engine revving toward a ridge while everyone wondered if they'd get back. Those personal memories were more powerful than official records. Within regimental histories and oral accounts, the gun jeep lived on as a measure of human resourcefulness. When supply lines and doctrine were not enough, you can picture it now: a blazing sun, a thin trail of dust, a small jeep skimming across open ground with a crew that knows how thin the margin between escape and disaster is. They tell the story quietly with a kind of pride that never needed a headline. The machine was small. The stakes were enormous. And when the moment came, it was the people behind the wrenches and the wheels who decided the outcome. So when someone calls an idea crazy, remember what happened when men in the middle of war stopped waiting for permission and started building solutions. The war didn't change overnight because of a jeep, but for the men who were saved, for the platoons that found a clear route where there had been none, the difference was everything. That is how one small idea, welded in haste and driven in courage, turned a jeep into a tank killer and turned a little innovation into a lasting lesson. This was not the story of a miracle. It was the story of people who refused to accept helplessness. They built a way out, and for that, hundreds came home. If you like these kinds of true, overlooked histories, subscribe and we'll dig up the next one.